Trump Tower, completed back in 2009. As I said, it's wrapped in about 30 miles of steel and glass. So for context, if you took all the glass on this building and you put it in like head to toe, you lined it up, you could stretch it from here in Chicago all the way down to Gary, Indiana for you locals. So it's a ton of steel and glass. But the building is actually primarily made out of concrete. It is just wrapped in steel and glass. Now, one of the things that I like to do on my tours is with these multi-million-dollar projects that we're going to be looking at today, such as Trump Tower and many others, is I like to point out the architectural mistakes that the architects make when designing these multi-million-dollar buildings, because they still make mistakes. Nobody gets away with it. You still make errors no matter how much money you're paid. So Trump Tower, what I like to point out here is this empty commercial space here on the right-hand side. You'll notice there's no Starbucks, no gift shops. It's all empty space, none of it's being used. The reason for that is the architects made a huge error when designing these spaces, and they made the ceiling heights too low. Thus, it is against the Chicago building code law to have any commercial business lease that space. So now it is all glorified storage for the Trump Tower. So Trump Tower loses out on a couple $1 million a year in rent that they could be using that space for. So huge error on Trump's part. So I like to do that with a lot on the buildings because it's like mildly entertaining. Now here on the right-hand side, we're going to do this black box building. It's the former IBM building, but it's now the American Medical Association building. And I know it's not much to look at. It's just steel and glass. It's a simple black box is what I call it. But this was the last modern building designed by Mies van der Rohe before he passed away. Now, Mies van der Rohe here in Chicago is referred to as the father of modernism. He immigrated to the U.S. from Germany to practice modernism. Now, modernism is the style that he got from his design philosophy, which was less is more. So you got simple shapes, simple forms. Less is more, the bare minimum. And Germans hated that style, so Mies van der Rohe immigrated from Germany to the U.S. in order to build that style here in Chicago. And he was not only an architect here in the city, practicing modernism and developing its popularity, but he was also a professor, and this is one of his students here on the right-hand side. So Mies van der Rohe trained many architects that eventually practiced in the city. These are the Chicago corn cobs, but their real name is the Marina City Towers. Now, these are by Bertrand Goldberg. Bertrand Goldberg was a student of Mies van der Rohe. You can tell that he did not believe in modernism like his professor. He had his own design philosophy, that design philosophy being that there are no right angles in nature, so there should be no right angles in architecture. Hence, only curvilinear designs were made by Bertrand Goldberg in his time. Now, the Marina City Towers also have those 19 floors of open parking. And those buildings were completed in the 1960s. People might have still been hopeful for flying cars in the future. Now, that is why they left that parking open, in case people might be able to fly their cars in and park it at some point in the future. The Marina City Towers were also the first notable residential buildings north of the Chicago River. For many, many decades, the river was used only for industry. It was the home of many warehouses, factories, things like that, lined the river and was used for industry. It was not the recreational space that we know it is today. And one of those warehouses is still standing. It's coming up here on the right-hand side. It's one of the oldest buildings we're going to see today, from back in 1916 here on the right as you come underneath the bridge. This is the Reed Murdoch Center by George Nimmons. It's your classic, this is your classic Chicago warehouse style here on the right. Now, what I love about this building is you take a look at that clock tower, which was very necessary back in the day because timepieces were expensive, watches, pocket watches, and things like that in the early 1900s. What's interesting is if you take that clock tower in the center and you count the bays of windows to the right of the clock tower, you're going to count 6 on the right, and if you count the bays of windows to the left of that clock tower, you're only going to count 5. This entire building is asymmetrical. Now, the reason for that is because of this bridge that we're going underneath right now. When this bridge was being installed about 15 years after the Reed Murdoch Center was complete, when Chicago was expanding north, in order to squeeze this bridge in, they had to knock down the side of that building in order to get that bridge to fit. So that building was knocked, that 6th bay of windows was knocked down in order to fit that bridge in, which is pretty unique. Now here on the right, this is 300 North LaSalle, a much more modern building. This is a Platinum LEED certified building. Now LEED means Leadership, Energy, and Environmental Design, meaning this building is extremely good for the environment. It's made out of 60% recycled materials, and on a hot day like today, it does not have a conventional air conditioning system. It uses river water pumped underneath the ground up to the top of the building, and it uses that river water to cool the building throughout the day. Very expensive system, but very good for the environment. Now, one of our most iconic buildings, in my opinion, is up here on the right-hand side. It takes up the entire, this entire bay here along the river. This is the Merchandise Mart from 1930. This is your classic Art Deco style. Now Art Deco, you've got that geometric ornamentation along the bottom, and you got those setbacks up at the very top, those setbacks being the main characteristic of the style. Now when this building, the Merchandise Mart, was completed in 1930, this was the largest building in the world by square footage. 4.2 million square feet of space, and it has over 8 miles of hallway. It was built as a consolidation of 14 warehouses. So the Marshall Field Company had 14 warehouses around the Chicago area, wanted one building to house all of it, hence the Merchandise Mart, the largest building in the world in 1930. Of course, it's no longer the largest building in the world, not by a long shot, but it is the second largest concrete building in the United States, and second to the Pentagon is the only concrete building in the U.S. larger than the Merchandise Mart. Now here on the right-hand side, we've got some new buildings. This is Wolf Point East that we're crossing now. It's a new residential building that was completed a few years ago, and this is the newest building here on the block, the Salesforce Tower. They haven't even really done the interior yet, and it was just completed this year. Now these buildings sit on Wolf Point, which is a very historic location here in Chicago, because this is where our first settlements were. Our first hotel, first couple taverns, first post office, things like that. This is where people settled in the 1800s when they first came to Chicago, here at the junction of the Chicago rivers and on Wolf Point specifically off to the right. That is the south branch of the Chicago River. Down to the left there, we'll be exploring that later, but for now we're going up the north branch. So here at the junction of the Chicago River is kind of the center of our city. So it actually became the symbol for Chicago. Now this symbol is on a lot of bridges, manhole covers, things like that. And you can see this symbol embedded into the fence here along the right-hand side, this fence or railing. It's got this Y-shaped symbol that's been embedded in it. That is the symbol for Chicago, and each arm on that Y-shape represents one of the branches of the Chicago River. Now we're going to move off to the left-hand side now. We got this building coming up, just up here on the left. This is the Residence of River Bend by James Stefano. This was put up back in 2002, and this building, all the living space has been put on the east side. That is the side of the building that we're on, where all those balconies and windows are. This was put up in 2002. It was a very expensive building to live in because they had absolutely fantastic views of the main branch of the Chicago River. Now, if you look what they're looking at now, they now get to look at Salesforce Tower, and they get to look at Wolf Point West in this building right here. So property values dipped quite a bit for these poor owners. A lot of people tried to move out, could not get the price that they got when they moved in. Super unfortunate for them. Now for one of the oldest buildings along the river here on the left is Fulton House. This red brick building up here. This was originally used for cold storage. You can tell it was used for cold storage. You just look inside those balconies, you can see those cold thick walls that would have been lined with horsehair and cork in order to keep all that cold air in. In the 1980s, this building was converted into the condos that it is today by a guy named Harry Reese, who was not just an architect, but also an avid sailor. So he liked to put nautical themes into his designs. You can see the starfish he put on the outside of the Fulton House. So a lot of nautical themes. So he converted that building right there. He also did these iconic little cottages here on the left-hand side. These are the Chicago River cottages, also by Harry Reese. Now you can see those nautical themes in it, those spiral staircases, those porthole windows, and he's a huge fan of triangles. It's one of his main characteristics is he'll put triangular roof lines, triangular windows, or just a triangle shape in general in his building. Now if you look back at the Chicago River cottages, as we come underneath the bridge, you can see that the roof line of those cottages make the shape of two sails. That is what he was going for there. Now those are put up in the 1980s, sold for a couple $100,000 for each of the 5 cottages. But one of the original residents moved out a few years ago, and one of those 4,000 square foot cottages sold for $2.2 million to live here next to the Chicago River. So very expensive to get here these days. Now here on the right is the East Bank Club. This is a very fancy gym essentially, and a lot of our celebrities have worked out here, from Michael Jordan to the Obamas to Oprah Winfrey, have all had memberships at the East Bank Club. What I like to talk about this building are these wonderful trees that they've got here. The windows facing the river, it's all super nice. But when this building was put up in the 1970s, there were no windows, there were no trees, it was a big wall facing away from the river. That is because our river was extremely dirty. It's still pretty dirty today, but we're working on cleaning it. That's why property values have increased next to our Chicago River. So that's how those buildings were treated back in, all the way up until even the 80s and 90s. Nobody wanted to live next to the river, they just turned their back to it. But then you can see the change in opinion here on the left. This is Kinsey Park. Now these are 70 European row-style homes, and every single one of these 70 homes, built in 2002, sold for $1.2 million each on the plans alone. Not a single home had been built yet. Every single one of them was sold before a single brick was put on the ground, or a foundation was laid, or whatever. So that's Kinsey Park. It's a gated community here in Chicago. And you can go in it, but they do close their doors at about 9 p.m. Now here on the right, this is a great example of adaptive reuse. So these are the Chicago River lots. Used to be the Wallace Printing Company, and essentially adaptive reuse is when you keep that original building up, you got the interior and you give it a new purpose. You see those iron balconies that have kind of just been put on? They kind of say it's like an afterthought. They say that's one of the signs that you can tell a building's been adaptively reused. But just the general age of the building. Now adaptive reuse is fantastic for older buildings. It's a great way of preserving history, and a great way for saving money for the people making those buildings. I hope he's not doing that on the way back. It's going to be annoying. Now up here on the right-hand side, I'm going to look inside this park here. Got this building coming into view with these large diagonal trusses off on the right there. That is Erie on the park, of those diagonal or tubular trusses is the correct term. So that's Erie on the park, and its cousin building is now popping up directly to our right. That is Kingsbury on the park. These two buildings are the only European industrial style buildings we have in Chicago. They were built also in 2002, and these are the only ones that we have in Chicago because the style never really got very popular. These are by Lucien Lagrange, who's your architect, and he never designed anything else in Chicago again due to the lack of popularity for the design. But I want to look off in the distance there. We're going to talk about this building for a moment. Those concrete corners and that blue glass, that black blue glass facade. Those concrete corners down in the distance. That is the Montgomery. Your architect is Mayuri Yamasaki. He's the same guy who designed the Twin Towers in New York. So he's a very notable architect. And that Montgomery was home to the Montgomery Ward Catalog Company here in Chicago up until the late 1990s when they went out of business. That building has now been converted into condos, but I want to talk about its first owner, Aaron Montgomery Ward. Now, Aaron Montgomery Ward, a lot of this area is named after him. This is Montgomery Park, and we're going to be looking at some of his original buildings later on. He was a huge figure here in Chicago in the early 1900s, and throughout the 1900s, because he started his catalog company here in our city. Now, I'm the youngest tour guide at Wendella. I'm only 21 years old, so I did have to do a bit of research as to exactly what a catalog was, because I did not know when I first started this job. It was a little bit... so I had to get it explained to me, so it's basically an Amazon today. So yeah, it was this big book. You pull them up and they mail whatever in the book that you wanted to order. So I had to learn that, which is pretty fun for me. Anyway, so he starts his catalog company here in Chicago. He did a lot of great things for the city, so a lot of stuff is named after him here. And one of the best things that he did for Chicago, I'm sure if you guys are now, for people who are visiting the city, you've definitely checked out Grand Park, you've seen Buckingham Fountain most likely, the Bean, things like that. He is the reason we have Grand Park today. So after the Chicago fire, as I said, that devastating event, we were rebuilding the city. And the land where Grand Park sits today was mainly home to rubble from the fire. Big heifers, some old railroad tracks, and that was about it. A lot of real estate developers wanted to put up residential buildings so they could make a lot of money. Put it right where Grand Park is today, right there in the center of the city. Now, when Aaron Montgomery Ward, when he sold this land, he sold the opportunity for it to be free and clear for the people of Chicago forever. So what he did is he spent millions of dollars of his own money suing real estate developers in order for them to not put any buildings where Grand Park sits today. He won all of these court cases eventually, and the land was given to the city of Chicago, creating Grand Park. So Aaron Montgomery Ward is one of the primary reasons we have Grand Park today, and we have 26 miles of uninterrupted lakefront that is all public land. So it's one of our things that we like to boast about in Chicago. We have no private beaches in our city. Now here on the right-hand side, we got this absolutely massive building. So this is called the Domain, and it's a huge warehouse, which is where Aaron Montgomery Ward would fill out all those catalog orders. So basically, it's an Amazon fulfillment center, but for the early 1900s. Now Aaron Montgomery Ward had the Domain here, and it's been converted into condos and commercial space. But when they were renovating it and converting it, they found 300 pairs of roller skates in the basement. Now that's because one of the jobs you could get here in the mid-1900s was, the title was called a picker, and your job was to roller skate up and down the length of this warehouse filling out all those catalog orders. So one of the more fun jobs you could get when working for Aaron Montgomery Ward. Now this is as far north as we go on the river. This is Goose Island off to the right-hand side. Not much is on Goose Island. It's home to a lot of warehouses. And they say it was set for some construction before COVID, but nothing ever happened. The reason for its name being Goose Island is in the 1800s. This is where our Irish immigrants would raise and breed their geese. As we turn around here, we're going to continue talking about Aaron Montgomery Ward, because we're in his neck of the woods, so while we're here, we'll talk about him. So he was also a huge fan of the Chicago World's Fair. So after the Chicago fire, we rebuilt the city in roughly 20 to 40 years. We rebuilt it enough that we thought we were able to host the next World's Fair. The previous one had been in Paris. We wanted the next one, so we sent our politicians down to Washington to lobby for the fair. We eventually did get it. It was called the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, or the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. It took place down in Jackson Park, down on the south side of the city, and it was a huge event. It was the event that put Chicago back on the map. It was open for about 2.5 years. Roughly 22 million people visited Chicago in those 2.5 years that the fair was open. For a rough context, that's a third of the United States. Only 60 million people lived in the U.S. in 1893, so about a third of the country had come to Chicago throughout those 2.5 years. So it really boosted our economy after that fire. It really got us back up on our feet. Many new inventions and were being shown. Many cultures were on display from around the world. It was a fantastic event, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. To get back to Aaron Montgomery Ward, he was a fan of the fair. He actually bought one of the relics from the fair, because not much still stands. Only one building remains from the fair, and that is the Science and Industry Museum. So if you guys have visited the Science and Industry Museum, that's the only building still standing from the Chicago World's Fair. If you look up to the left here, you got this little statue sitting on top of this building on the other side of the bridge. That green statue up there, there she is. That is the Statue of Progress, and she was bought by Aaron Montgomery Ward. She was bought by Aaron Montgomery Ward to look over his warehouse. So this is his original office building here on the left-hand side. Put her on the original office building to look over the warehouse. So, huge fan of the fair. Fair was this great event, really helped us recover from that fire. We'll get a little bit more into that later. Now, here on the right-hand side, we've got this massive brick wall that you can stare at. This is the Freedom Center, was part of the Chicago Tribune, and this is the warehouse where they print hundreds of thousands of newspapers a day, and it's no longer being used for that. It's used for a lot of film and TV at the moment, but they say it's set for demolition because it might be the next spot for Chicago's very first casino called the Temporary. They said that this was one of the finalist locations here in our city for that casino to go up. Now, I have kind of a fun little story about this warehouse, why it has a soft spot in my heart, and why I'd miss it if it was gone. And that's because when I first started this job last summer, I was shadowing another tour guide. I was just sitting on the side listening to him, and I got to see the cause of Chicago fire in this parking lot here on the right-hand side, having lunch between doing like a fire warehouse scene or something like that. And that show, for me, has a soft spot in my heart because I'm not originally from the U.S. I'm originally South African, so as my research before I immigrated here when I was 15 was to watch a bunch of Chicago fire. That was the only research I did, so I didn't really know too much about the city, but that was pretty fun for me. Otherwise, this is a great part of town. If you ever want to come to this park, I do recommend it. Best taco truck in Chicago is here next to Montgomery Park. Can't see it from here. I always tell the guy that I'm a tour guide, and he should give me a discount because I shout him out, but I always forget to record myself saying it, so he never believes me. But his tacos are really good and they're really cheap, so I always like coming over here on this side of town. Otherwise, we're heading down back to the junction of the rivers, and we're going to start working our way to the South Branch. But for now, we're going to talk a little bit about Chicago as a city historically, and how we got to be the third largest city in the United States. Because we are currently the third largest. We're set to be overtaken by Houston in the next couple of years, but Houston is a city primarily made out of parking lots, so, you know, they got a high population, but, you know, not as nice a city in my opinion. I did visit, no offense if you're from Houston, obviously. Anyway, so we're the third largest city in the United States. How did we get to be here? So the first people to be on this land next to Lake Michigan and here in Illinois were, of course, the Native Americans. They were here long before any Europeans were. But the first Europeans to come through this land were two guys named Marquette and Joliet. Now these two guys were French. They were from from New France or Canada, and they were on a mission to explore the Mississippi. The Mississippi is west of us. Their job was to go south down the Mississippi to map it out and see if where it led. Did it go out to the Gulf of Mexico, which we know today? Did it go out to the Atlantic, or some even speculated the Pacific Ocean? So their job was to map it out, and they start working their way down the Mississippi. They make it about as far as Arkansas before they are told they are going to encounter Spanish colonizers or not-so-friendly Native Americans who would not appreciate them going any further south. So they kind of stopped at Arkansas and started heading back up the Mississippi, kind of put the mission on pause. So as they're heading back up, they come to a part of the river where they meet a local friendly Native American tribe called the Potawatomi. Potawatomi say you can take a shortcut from the Mississippi back up to New France. You just have to go off the river, up the Illinois River, up the Des Plaines River, and you come to this marshy piece of land where Chicago sits today. They just have to pick up their kayaks and carry them along the lakefront. Now, the original name for Lake Michigan was the Ocean of Illinois. So they were told to go via the Ocean of Illinois, and they did, and they simply mapped the area. We didn't have our first resident here until over 116 years later. That was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He settled here along the main branch of the Chicago River, right where the Apple Store is today. So if you guys went to the Apple Store while you're here, there on Michigan Avenue, that's where the very first resident of Chicago had his homestead. He was a successful fur trader here along the along the Chicago River. A lot of people followed him, and eventually the federal government, a couple of years later in 1805, built their first fort right where the London House is today, so across the river from the Apple Store. Our population was still pretty low, a couple hundred people at this time. You could fit the population of Chicago onto this river. Now, our population only boomed in 1825 when the Erie Canal was put in. Now, this canal connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, bringing a lot more trade to this area. A lot more people started to settle here. We went from a few hundred to a few thousand to a few 100,000 people living in Chicago by 1871. This was the year of the Great Chicago Fire. This fire, as I mentioned earlier, started southwest side of our city. It burnt down 17,000 homes and businesses, left 100,000 people homeless, and about 250 people did lose their lives. It was a huge tragedy for the city. And what's nice about this tour is that we do get to actually see the location where the Chicago Fire started once we get down there. That'll be down further on the South Front. We'll talk more about the fire then. As I said, we recovered from the fire, and we had that next World's Fair, the Chicago World's Fair. What's a fun fact about these fairs is that they all have centerpieces. The previous fair to the Chicago World's Fair was the one I said in Paris. Now the centerpiece to the fair in Paris, that was the Eiffel Tower, designed by Gustave Eiffel. Now a fun fact about Chicago is Gustave Eiffel actually offered to build us our own Eiffel Tower here in Chicago. So we're actually going to have our own Eiffel Tower, and it was going to be twice the size of the one in Paris. Now we did say no to this because we wanted an American to design something for our centerpiece. So we hired a guy named George Ferris, and George Ferris was a bridge builder who had recently designed the Ferris wheel. So the very first Ferris wheel ever on display, that was at the Chicago World's Fair. And it was about 70 feet taller than our current Ferris wheel. So if you guys have been to Navy Pier, we're going to see it later. That Ferris wheel is 70 feet shorter than that first Ferris wheel at the Chicago World's Fair. It was an absolutely massive Ferris wheel. Each one of the gondolas was a full-size train car that could hold up to 60 passengers. This Ferris wheel could hold about 15 to 1,800 people at a time. Absolutely massive. That was the centerpiece for the Chicago World's Fair. Looks like we're coming up on the junction now. I recommend that you guys grab a photo down the main branch of the river off to the left-hand side once we do get that view. But then after that, we're going to be talking about some buildings back on the right-hand side as we head down the South Front. Otherwise, grab some photos of this main branch of the river, and kind of imagine, or in your head, think about how our city has grown down here. So as we come around the bend here, I'll point out some of the stuff that we've spoken about so far. So back early 1800s, you would have been able to see Lake Michigan from here. That's how flat it was. You would have been able to see the lake from back here if you were just like standing slightly higher than the river. So here we got Chicago Corn Cobs, 1960s. That's what you're seeing there with that white puck face. We spoke about the Reed Murdoch Center from 1914, 1916. One of the oldest buildings currently along the main branch of the river. Then of course you got the Merchandise Mart from 1930, being the largest building in the world in 1930 by square footage. Absolutely massive. And still the second largest concrete building in the United States. But now we're going to be talking about some engineering up here on the right-hand side, because this building doesn't look like it should be working. Up here on the right has this extremely skinny base, which is only 1/3 the width of its roof. Its base is only 40 feet wide. This is 150 North Riverside. This building is an engineering marvel. Nobody ever thought this land would be used, because it is so small you could fit nothing on it, because there are railroad tracks running underneath the ground, limiting your foundation to only that 40 feet of space. What's cool about this building is you can actually see our boat in it, so you can all take a look at yourselves as we come past it. So 150 North Riverside was designed by Getch & Partners, and Getch & Partners, this was their brainchild, was to have this tapered bottom to their building. You can see these steel I-beams that run up along the side of the building. Those steel I-beams are made from some of the strongest steel in the world, constructed in Luxembourg, shipped here for this project, and is currently holding this building up. There's a couple other features that make this building pretty incredible engineering-wise, but I'll talk about those on the way back. But that is 150 North Riverside, one of our more unique modern buildings, I believe, from 2018. Now, another building that's pretty unique engineering-wise is up here on the right-hand side. This is called 100 North Riverside. Now, 100 North Riverside, or the Boeing building, all I need you to know about this building is that there is a taller side, that's the north side, and there's the south side, that is the shorter side. Now, what we know about all buildings in general, especially skyscrapers, is they are required to have a foundation going really, really deep below ground, all the way down to bedrock. A lot of our buildings here have foundations going as deep as 50 to 70 feet below grade, so extremely deep. Now, with this building here on the right, this south side of the building, the shorter side, it does not have enough foundation required to hold up a building of that size. They were limited because there are railroad tracks running underneath the ground, limiting where a foundation can go. So they came up with a pretty unique solution for this problem, because they still wanted to have the building to be as large as possible. So what they did is, if you look up to the top of it, last time you have to turn around on the chart, I promise, there is a big truss up there, that big X, that is one of 5 trusses that is suspending the south side of the building from the north side. It is holding it from the top, reducing the load on the foundation below. So it is being suspended, which you don't see often in architecture, is a suspended building. But yeah, that's 100 North Riverside. Here to our right is 2 North Riverside Plaza. This was the very first public plaza in Chicago. The success of this plaza in the 1920s is the reason it is now written into Chicago law to have a public space at the base of your building. Because it was quite controversial to buy this expensive land, but only build on top of it and give the other half to the public. But that was a successful choice, and public plazas are now required in our city. And you can see those train tracks that I said run below the ground. You actually get to see those here on the right-hand side and hear them. So this is a Metro train. You can see deep inside of there. Metro is the line that connects Chicago to its surrounding suburb. We also have Amtrak that connects Chicago to the rest of the U.S. Now, Chicago is the railroad hub of the country because we're right in the center of the U.S. And we also had all these large catalog companies shipping out catalog orders by train. So when you ordered mail back then, it would come by train. Mail comes by truck today. So this is how the mail would have been delivered. Our post office was connected to our railroad, and that railroad had to reach all corners of the U.S. to deliver that mail. Now you'll notice these buildings sit above the railroad. These are some simple modern buildings, kind of like Mies van der Rohe's less is more style. These are not by Mies van der Rohe, but they're by his students who did believe in that modernist style. These buildings are quite unique because they do not own the land that they sit on. So they are sitting above the railroad, so it's not technically land, they're sitting above the railroad. So what they do is they do this interesting thing where they use something called air rights. So they pay Amtrak a fee every single year to pay to occupy the air above the railroad tracks, because it is not technically land, so they're paying to lease the air from Amtrak. So that's how these buildings are able to build above the railroad. So this building up here on the right-hand side is another modern building, very simple, it's just a box made out of glass. Now, we're going to touch on modernism for a moment. You've seen it in every city you've been to. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with a building that's just square, that is just square with glass or steel. This one has a prefabricated exterior. But the issue with modernism today is they say it is taking away the individuality of cities around the world. Because I'm sure all of you are from different cities with different skylines. A lot of people are saying skylines are starting to look too similar. So what cities are doing is they're giving tax incentives and other benefits to architects and developers who design buildings that aren't modern anymore. So we're done. Cities are trying to move away from having square glass buildings and have something that is unique, so cities remain unique. Because they worry, as I said at the beginning, cities are losing their individuality. Here's a pretty unique modern building here to the right. Now what these guys did is they took, if you look into the side of the building, you can see they used convex and concave glass to create this kaleidoscope effect, distorting the reflection of those surrounding buildings. That's pretty unique, and it also has this bend in it. Now this bend in the building is supposedly, it doesn't look like it's very bent around the Chicago River, but it's supposedly matching the bend of the Chicago River, contextualizing with it, making the building fit on its site better, or make it look like it fits better on its site. So that's what contextualism is, when the building's form complements the site that it sits on. Now if we have any Dark Knight fans, like Christopher Nolan movie with when the Joker robs the bank in the opening scene, Gotham Bank is behind these windows here on the right hand side. Just behind these signs here for Wolverines and Uber. So you can go in that lobby. This is the old Chicago post office. It was 2.2 million square feet space. It's about half the size of the merchandise mart. And as I said, we had to ship off all those catalog orders from somewhere. So this massive deco style post office was used to build all of those catalog orders and other things like that. And it even has this highway right underneath it. So if you guys came to Chicago from the west side, you might have come in from this highway. Anyway, this post office moved out of it back in the 1990s. They wanted a more modern facility that was no longer shipping by train, specifically shipping by truck. So this post office was left alone for many years, and it became kind of a hazard until the owner who bought it up was eventually forced to sell it because the city was going to take it from him under eminent domain. Eminent domain is when a building becomes dangerous enough that the city will just take it from you if you're not maintaining it. So this building was finally sold off and went under an $800 million renovation. The roof of the building was converted into a 3-acre park, and the entire interior was redone. One of the most expensive renovations in our city. So that is the old post office. And our new post office is sitting here on the right-hand side. They simply moved across the street. So this is the more modern facility that they wanted. So as you can see, they ship by truck now. So this post office was designed by Knight and Associates in the early 2000s. And what they decided to do with this post office was give it a grand ballroom-like lobby, a beautiful lobby. In order for the owners of the building, the government, in order for the government to make money back on this building. Because post offices, they run at a deficit. Every year they lose money. So they were hoping by giving it a grand ballroom-like lobby, they would be able to rent out that lobby for weddings, for mitzvahs, and other such events, corporate events, things like that. Now, it's very strange that they did this in a post office, and they built this over 2 decades ago now. Not a single event has taken place in that lobby. It was a huge waste of money for the taxpayers because post offices are built on our taxes, so that was a huge waste giving it that beautiful. It is a nice lobby, but nobody's ever thought my wedding and the post office, they don't really mesh. Here on the left-hand side, we got the Reed. This is our newest residential building here in the South Loop. So we're in the South Loop now, and this one has just been completed this year. I believe a couple of people have already moved in. So this is the newest building here on the South Loop, and it sits right next to the oldest building here in the South Loop. And this is from way back in the 1980s. You might recognize the style. We spoke about it earlier. So this building here is called River City. River City was designed by Bertrand Goldberg, the same guy who designed the Chicago corn cobs we spoke about earlier. So you see that curvilinear design, where I'll repeat his design philosophy: no right angles in nature, so there should be no right angles in architecture. So that's why we have these curvilinear windows, curvilinear walls, and things like that. Bertrand Goldberg loved this building so much, he lived in it for about 10 years. And in 1983, when this building was completed, there was nothing around it, as it was the first building here along the first residential building along the South Loop. The people who first moved into this building in the 1980s, the only place they could shop was a 7-Eleven about 3 blocks east of here, because there was absolutely nothing in this area. Now, River City makes this large S shape, and this building was supposed to be part of a larger development that was going to snake its way in this S shape down this left-hand side of the river here through all these parking lots. But because in the 1980s Chicago was not a huge fan of the design, it was never, all those plans were halted, so we only got the singular River City. So I think is unfortunate, because I think it's one of our most unique buildings that we have along the river, and I prefer it over the corn cobs in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. It's pretty bad there. Now, up here on the right-hand side, I did mention that we do get to see where the Chicago fire started on this tour. If you look off to the right now, you can see a radio tower off there, and I'm not sure if they built that radio tower specifically to tell us where the Chicago fire started, but that is the exact location, pretty much on the dot. That is where Catherine O'Leary's barn was, right where that radio tower is. Now, we all know the story. If you haven't, I'll repeat it now, is that Catherine O'Leary went out late at night to milk her cow Daisy on October 7th of 1871. Cow got startled, knocked over the lantern lit on some hay, barn went alit, started the Chicago fire, spread north, destroying everything in its path. Now, that entire story, unfortunately, was fabricated by a New York reporter to sell more newspapers. He completely lied about it. But he only revealed that he lied about it on his deathbed over 50 years later. So, pretty much the damage was done, and Catherine O'Leary and her family were pushed out of Chicago, and they were forced to restart somewhere else. Now, a full investigation was launched, sadly in the 1990s, way later, to whether she was guilty for starting the Chicago fire. They found no evidence that the O'Learys were guilty for starting the Chicago fire. Unfortunately, that was long after Catherine O'Leary's death, but they are completely innocent. And we'll touch more on the Chicago fire in just a moment. I do like talking about this building that is falling apart at the moment. So this is an old coal-burning warehouse where Amtrak would burn coal in order to power their trains. So we no longer burn fossil fuels in the US, so it's been abandoned for a while. Architectural preservation is trying to keep it alive. I don't think they're going to be able to because there's no infrastructure going up to the building. There's no roads leading to it. But some say it could be like a train museum in the future, so that might be something to look out for here on the south side. Might have a new train museum going in there. Or some Belgian architects told me it could be a really nice restaurant. So maybe something will happen in the future. Anyway, about the fire. So how did it start? If it was not Catherine O'Leary, who was it? We do not actually know. We only have theories to this day. Some of those theories being a lightning strike could have started the fire, which is quite plausible. Another theory was it could have been a mob hit because Catherine O'Leary's son had gambling debts and the mob burnt down the barn as collateral for those gambling debts. And there's not a lot of solid evidence behind that one, but it's one of the more realistic ones. The third one being a meteorite shower because Michigan and a few other states in the area were experiencing meteorite showers that exact night. They would say it could have been that. And then another one is that they could have said it was Peg Leg O'Sullivan, the O'Leary's neighbor, who was a sailor with a peg leg, who may have started the fire accidentally while lighting his pipe. But otherwise, those are all theories. We do not actually know the true reason why the Chicago fire started. We do know why it got so bad, though. Now, there were a few things that happened that allowed the fire to get as bad as it did. The previous summer happened in October, so that previous summer, August, July, June, there was no rain. We had about half an inch of rain, so the entire city was extremely dry. And everything back then was made out of cast iron or wood, so it was pretty much kindling at that point. Now, when the fire started at the barn, we had a strong southerly wind blowing it north. And it went through two unfortunate buildings as it spread its way north. The first one being so the first one I'll tell you is ironic, and then the second one is even more ironic. So the first one was a coal storage warehouse, was the first building I went through, super unfortunate. And then the second one I went through was a matchstick factory, which was about as bad as it could get for a fire. The entire building went alit, fire jumped over the Chicago River and spread its way north, destroying everything that it could. Now, firefighters tried their best to fight the fire, but eventually the fire spread to the pumping house where they pump water to put out fires, but the pumping house's roof was made out of wood. The roof caught fire, collapsed on the pumping equipment, and the firefighters were pretty much left useless by then. So, what put out the fire? 2 days later, after it was burning for 2 days, it was finally put out by rain. That was how the Chicago fire ended. So that's a little bit about the Chicago fire, and we don't know how it started, we know how it ended, and that's the gist of that story. So we can look here on the left-hand side now. After doing that history. Now this is the old railroad staging area. So the staging area is now to our right. The Amtrak used to stage their trains here on the left. Now this land has been vacant for a long time, and it was offered to Jeff Bezos to put up an Amazon Performance Center. We could all get our packages a little bit earlier. Now I'm kind of glad Jeff Bezos said no, because if you notice there's some new trees have been planted here. Some roads are being built. So you've got some lights, traffic lights have been installed already. down here because this land has now been designated to be Chicago's newest neighborhood. So this is where a bunch of new commercial buildings, residential buildings, parks, and places like that are going to be right here on this piece of land. Now, Chicago has 77 neighborhoods total, if you count them all. Lots of wonderful neighborhoods, very unique. So this will be our 78th neighborhood. So the developers decided to label it the 78th. That's the name. Probably not very creative in my opinion, but this will be the 78th in about 10 to 15 years. More like 15 to 20, I believe, sorry. About 15 to 20 years, they say it will be complete. So if you're ever back in Chicago in 20 years, you can come check out our new neighborhood. Now this is my favorite bridge. I'm pretty old and staring at it. This is the St. Charles Airline Bridge. This was used by the railroad when they needed to get the trains from that side of the river to where that old staging area was. Now this thing works. A couple weeks back they actually tested it. It doesn't look like it works, but it's historically preserved. So they never need to use it, but they are required to test it every year. And so the St. Charles Airline Bridge, I love it because it's got these massive concrete counterweights that balance out the weight of the bridge for those motors that lift it. And these bridges are so well balanced that it only takes a 10 to 15 horsepower motor to lift that entire bridge. That's how well balanced it is with those concrete counterweights. So St. Charles Airline Bridge is a single-leaf bascule trunnion bridge. Single-leaf meaning it opens on one side. Most of our bridges you'll notice open in the middle. That means they're double-leaf bascule trunnion bridges. So those are how our bridges work. We have 37 of them. We have the second most liftable bridges in a singular city in the entire world. The only city with more bridges that lift than us, that'll be Amsterdam. That's the only one. So we're number 2 there. Now here on the left-hand side, we've got the start of our Chinatown Park. This is Ping Tong Park. And red, you can see these red railings, and you'll see some red accents on the boathouse later. Red being the color of good fortune in Chinese culture. This is my local park, so I'd love to point it out. Unfortunately, this park was not the first one associated with the Chinatown community. Chinatown had 2 other parks a couple blocks east of here, right where the Dan Ryan Expressway is. So if you guys came to Chicago from the south, you guys may have come up that expressway. That expressway was put up in 1960, destroying the 2 parks that were associated with the Chinatown community, which is super unfortunate because Chinatown was left without a park associated with them for over 30 years. They did not have a park. They say 2 generations. Did not have a park while growing up here in the Chinatown area. So they fought for many, many years to get this land next to the Chicago River. The head of this push to get this land was a guy named Ping Tong, the namesake of the park. He was a real estate developer and businessman, and he helped raise the money for Chinatown to finally get this park in the late 1990s. So it is a wonderful park. It's got this boathouse that's directly ahead of us, and you can kayaking down here. It's a short stop. It's a short ride along the green line or the red line. You can come down to the Chinatown area and check it out. Looks like and you can see just through there, if you look through that bridge there, you can see the edge of a traditional Chinese pagoda that is also on the park. You can go check out if you're ever on this side of town. You can see there's a freight over there, so we're not able to get down there. Usually we go a little further south, but you know, we're busy around the river, so it looks like we'll be turning around just a little bit earlier. Yeah, so that is the Chinatown Park. I always recommend coming out and checking out if you're done with the hustle and bustle of Grand Park. Otherwise, right now we have some fantastic views of the southern skyline. So you got that, you got the St. Charles Airline Bridge. As we get around this warehouse here on the left, there are going to be some fantastic photo moments. So I'm going to give you guys a 5 to 10 minute break to take some pictures, grab a drink from your bar, grab a snack, something like that. We've been going for about 45 minutes now. So if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to come up and ask me at this time during the break. Otherwise, as I said, grab some photos, grab some drinks, and we'll get started back on the tour once we're just a little bit closer to the city. Otherwise, enjoy your break.